excelling in the coffee shop space these days is about being a great hospitality operator more than it is about being a great coffee operator.
This is Keys to the Shop, episode 504, Maintaining Excellence in Everyday Work with Maxwell Colonna Dashwood. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I am your host for the show. Always glad to have you here. Now, if this is your first time listening to Keys to the Shop, that's awesome. Welcome to the community, I suppose you could say. We have been doing this for the better part of 8 years. There's 900 plus episodes. The best way to get plugged in, subscribe and search for topics in your podcast player or on Spotify or on YouTube at Keys to the Shop. You can find it all there. It's a lot to search through, which is great news because whatever it is you want to learn about in your coffee career as a operator, an owner, a trainer, a manager, etc., that is something you can find at Keys to the Shop just by searching the topic. I'm thankful to say it's really awesome to look back and know that there's that much to choose from. But that's the best way to do it. There are some of you intrepid listeners that have actually listened to all of the episodes from 1 to a lot. And wow, I know I have to live with my own voice, so I know how it is. And so my apologies and also congratulations to you. But anyway, thank you everybody for subscribing to the show. That's huge. Also share the episodes on your social media. Share about Keys to the Shop. Tell people about it. Spread the word and rate and review the show. If you love this show, give us a 5-star rating or review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. That is huge for the show. So anyway, one of the things I want to draw your attention to is the fact that Keys to the Shop offers consulting and coaching. In fact, that's one of the main things that I do. I spend most of my time talking one-on-one with coffee shop operators. We've worked with dozens and dozens of people who own and operate, who are starting their first shop or have coffee shops that needed to have some specialized focus on particular areas to bring things to the next level or to solve some problems that have cropped up over the course of the years of operation. This is what I love to do. I love helping you through the show and being a coach and consultant for you. So if you've thought maybe we need to bring in somebody to help us, to walk alongside us in a project like scaling or refining or even just opening your first cafe, then email chris@keystotheshop.com. We're starting to build out the books for 2025, and I would love to have a conversation with you and see what's going on in your world and how I might be able to help you. So email me again, chris@keystotheshop.com. And by the way, Key Holder Coaching Groups are a support group for coffee shop managers. It's a mastermind that is very powerful for delivering perspective and community. That is going to be opening up next year, very shortly, actually, in March. So if you missed this time in fall, definitely email chris@keystotheshop.com. Let me know you're interested. We'll talk also. We're going to start opening up our applications a little bit earlier for that round in 2025. So just to put a bug in your ear about that. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Ground Control at groundcontrol.coffee, a revolutionary brewer that's helping coffee businesses all over the world create amazing batch brew and concentrates for batch iced lattes and cold brew. And also, we are sponsored today by the Barista Series from Pacific, the plant-based beverage powerhouse, performing amazing on the bar, pacificfoodservice.com. I'm going to talk about both of our amazing sponsors later on in this episode. But right now, let's get to our conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about something I have been putting episodes out about here for the last week or so. And it has to do with the subject of novelty and innovation versus the maintenance and excellence in the regular things that we do in the cafe. I came across a post by our friend Maxwell Colonna Dashwood on LinkedIn where he posted something from the Freakonomics podcast, and his commentary on it really resonated with me. And so I invited Maxwell back on the show. Now, if you don't know who Maxwell is, Maxwell founded and co-owns Colonna and Small's Specialty Coffee in Bath, England. It is a globally recognized destination coffee shop that centers around specialty coffee as an engaged drinking experience. Maxwell won the UK Barista Championships in 2012, 2014 and 15. And he reached the finals of the World Barista Championships also during that time and is a qualified Q grader. Now, Maxwell writes extensively on the subject of specialty coffee, along with blogs and articles. He has authored Water for Coffee with Christopher H. Hendon, which is a book exploring the chemistry of water and the effect it has on coffee's flavor. He is also the author of the Illustrated Coffee Dictionary, published by Octopus Books. And we had Maxwell on the show most recently to talk about his book, The Business of Specialty Coffee, which was a fantastic episode. You should listen to that one after you listen to this as well. And so I really appreciate the way that Maxwell approaches these things. It's a very level-headed and deeply practical way of viewing a complex arena like specialty coffee. And especially as we focus on specialty coffee shops, it's really important, especially today, to be level-headed and focused and rooted in the way that we embrace change, what changes we embrace, and how we view innovation. So in this conversation with Maxwell, we talk about maintenance in the excellence of the everyday and the idea that innovation as a pursuit in and of itself can actually be detrimental to coffee. And Maxwell is going to explain exactly why that might be and some ways that we can pursue operations in the cafe that deliver long-term sustainable excellence in customer experience and are really beneficial for the entire industry. So fascinating conversation as always. Maxwell delivers some very poignant insights here. So let's get right to it. Here now is our conversation with returning guest to the show, Maxwell Colonna Dashwood. Well, Maxwell, great to have you back on the show. How's it going today?
It's great, thanks, here in Bath. We're actually getting ready to move house, but this is a nice break in that spell of, it's less chaotic than usual because I pretty much got rid of everything I owned.
Oh, wow.
I'm in a rented accommodation at the moment with someone else's furniture, which is, has its pros and cons. But so it should be the easiest move I've done in a while, moving in with not a lot of just some boxes of books, really.
Excellent. Yeah, it's always a little bit difficult to go through some new adjustments there. But speaking of new, thinking a lot about your comments that you made on LinkedIn a little bit ago, I reached out to you as soon as I saw your post because it's maybe a signal in the air that I'd been thinking about myself a lot. And that's the idea of the obsession of new things in coffee. And a lot of the things that have been new in coffee, maybe it's a product or an understanding. You've been a part of these things throughout the history of your career, whether it's a book or tools to use to render great coffee. But you made a comment about the idea of maybe newness isn't exactly the thing that we should be chasing in and of itself. And I wonder if you can kind of explain or summarize what you were talking about in that post. And I have some questions about it because I feel like this is an important topic for us to focus on in the industry today.
I've been thinking about this idea for quite a long time about innovation. Although everyone clearly raves about the benefits of innovation and in modern culture and society, no one really questions the value of innovation. But people do push back on certain aspects of the modern world we live in and pursue sort of analog experiences or more quote unquote traditional or rooted experiences, whatever you want to call it. But then I was thinking about coffee in particular. And obviously my last book, really, if you think about it, was kind of more about maintenance than innovation, really. There's some chapters in it on maintenance, but that whole need to go, okay, how do the fundamentals of this industry from a business point of view work? I've flown through the first decade in coffee, very exciting, lucky to be involved in lots of innovative things, as you discussed. But quite early, I felt this sort of need to constantly do something new as part of, say, my identity in coffee or my businesses. And that seemed unsustainable to me. Because I don't want to do novelty for novelty's sake, right? That just has never seemed valuable to me, even at the beginning. But also this idea that you challenge something because you think there's an area to be challenged where you could improve value. But you start thinking, well, actually, okay, if we improve this area, say 98%, and there's only a few percent left, then is it sort of done? Have you got like a new norm? And at the same time as writing the business book, I was thinking, well, with coffee, like a lot of what we're trying to do from a business isn't do new things all the time. It's actually trying to do the same thing day in, day out very well. And to be honest, I'd always thought this when I got into hospitality. What I liked about hospitality was this idea of crafting a daily experience of a really high quality. And the reason it popped up in my head most recently, what I put on LinkedIn was a podcast by Freakonomics called In Praise of Maintenance. And it hit home with me. I hadn't really thought of it as the term of maintenance. I just thought of it as this idea of doing something very well, day in, day out, which is not flashy or new, but is difficult and valuable. I actually had a member of staff in my London shop. So my London shop opened just over a year ago now. And we got a great team of lots of very experienced coffee professionals. And one of the allures of coming to work for us is we do have this innovative narrative, and we have been involved in and continue to be involved in interesting things, whether it's the way the water's set up or freezer menus or thinking about grinding differently. I've always thought this hiring baristas, the barista that's excited to learn loads of new stuff is always a bit of a red flag for me, to be honest, because the day in, day out job is about just doing something and taking pride in doing something to a very high standard. And this member of staff was actually a bit difficult. And we had a team meeting and he said, I have a question. I was like, okay, great. He said, it might be too long for the time frame that we have. And his question was, okay, what are we going to be doing in the pursuit of being innovative and pioneering? Like, what's new? What's on the horizon? And it sort of took me by surprise because I thought I'd outlined very clearly what we're trying to achieve with the shop and decisions we'd very consciously made about how we were going to brew coffee, how we were going to present it. And I don't really put something new into the bar unless there's a reason to. And I'm a big believer that you don't present something to the customer until it's definitely better and you can do it consistently than what you were doing before. And I tried to explain to this member of the staff that actually the key element of what we do in our stores or our roastery is a bit like a Japanese sushi chef or a swords craftsman who's been doing it for 100 years. And that I'm pro-innovation and rethinking things, but actually I feel like the bulk of our mentality should be about crafting something to a high standard day in, day out, which is the same as it was the day before. We don't have to constantly change everything. And actually, in terms of what we're doing as a business and what our customers love and what I love, I actually started to realize that, you need to sit back and appreciate that you're doing something very well. And that in and of itself should be rewarding. It doesn't have to change all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I'm curious about the catalyst for just the desire to change things a lot. And here's my assumption. I wonder what you would say to this, having viewed and participated in a wide swath of the industry. Innovation at some point, I think, with specialty coffee and the way we make it and how we serve it and things like that, feel like they were based mostly on an observed and felt experienced lack or issue that was a very obvious problem to solve. And that, as you mentioned earlier, there's like, we've got it 98% solved, and now we're left with this last 2%, kind of like when you're counting to 10, but you don't want it to be over. So you count 9, 9.5. So like, we don't want the innovation to be over. How have we shifted our perspective of innovation, and how has innovation itself sort of informed the way we think about it? Because it does seem as though we don't want it to be over, and that there might be other things we should be thinking about.
Just to be clear, maybe my 98% was probably a step too far, because I guess there's easy innovation and there's hard innovation. And I think for a long time in coffee, the innovation, I wouldn't say it was easy. It was difficult in its own way, but it was something that a lot of us could partake in. We could play around with how we serve coffee in the shop to try and change the narrative. And that was, I don't need a big R&D lab to play around with that innovation. I can do it in my little cafe. There's a risk to me, for sure. I might piss all my customers off. But, I felt like there's been a lot of innovation through coffee competitions, through blogs, that a lot of us as what we would call a community of coffee people could be involved in that innovation and be a part of that movement. I think a lot of that job was awareness and engagement. And I think that's the bit that's 98% done. I think it's an opt-in industry now. So I think people know coffee's interesting and they decide whether they would like to, how far they'd like to go down that rabbit hole. It's this whole idea of showing someone this idea that coffee can be a culinary wonder like wine that doesn't really surprise anyone anymore. Mm-hmm. At least I don't think so. So then the hard innovation that's left actually becomes sort of classic, difficult innovation, I think, which, is sort of science driven and technology driven. And unfortunately, not as many of us can be involved in that. It costs loads of money. It's very difficult. We could be involved in it in some way. To your point, I also think that character types are drawn to topics at certain moments in time. And if you were drawn to coffee when you saw it as a subculture that, was a bit of a crusade, and you wanted to join that crusade of popularizing and espousing the wonders that coffee could be, you joined it at that moment. It's now sort of gone beyond that moment. And maybe it doesn't match your character type of the things you like to be involved in anymore. A friend of mine who's involved in startups says, after 2-3 years, when the startup gets past that initial phase, he moves to the next startup. I think it's, probably a lot of us don't want to just move to the next coffee. Maybe it's been to bar cocoa, I think that making that change, and I often believe a lot of us view an industry through when we got into it. What we observed at the beginning and built up this picture of an industry, still, even if we're good at changing our mind and observing, still we sort of go back to. if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, things like, competition and the narrative we have, we still place a lot of emphasis on being new in terms of how we sell coffee. And I already think that that's interesting to watch, that some of the narratives of small independent coffee businesses are actually slightly outdated, but they still need that position of the underdog fighting an interesting fight or something. So when you messaged about it, I think there's a lot in there about what people are drawn to and what they like about something. It feels very similar to me to, say, a music movement. You're into very niche music and that band starts to gain some mainstream traction, and that's not for you anymore. You don't want to identify as someone who likes something that the mass likes. And I've always thought that was a bit of an irony bit about coffee. You often had a lot of people in coffee early saying, we want it to be super accessible and we want loads of people to be into it, but they didn't really. It's actually, that's happened. And then your club, or your special, unique club has gone, right? So I think there's a lot here about identity and what people align with and what they think is valuable in the world. A bit like you said earlier, you said, there's a clear problem to solve. Everyone likes a clear problem to solve. It feels like they're moving forward. It's a very human thing to do, and maybe definitely a more modern cultural thing to do. We often associate the idea of doing something the way it's been done. The word tradition is often quite negative, right?
Sure.
There's a lot associated there with, aspects of culture that definitely needed to change. But I guess, that's why I use that Japanese example. I think people are in wonder at someone who's been doing the same thing in the same space to a super high standard for 50 years.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a transition that a lot of us are going to have to go through in specialty coffee, to go, okay, we've done the sort of young, plucky upstart thing. Now, how do we evolve and mature into this? Let's present something of a very considered, intentional, refined standard over time. And maybe that's just a growing up thing. I'm not saying everyone in coffee is the same age, but at some point, I think in a field like coffee, you probably would move more towards refinement and replication of quality and away from innovation.
Well said. And to complement the idea, the identity piece, I think, is so huge because we project not just what we value. It's a way of saying, I have value as a professional. And if I can see change happen as a result of my work, then I have staked a claim. I have a monument erected to my own image, in a sense. So not to get too far down that road, but I think we do like to innovate an industry, a product and process, but maybe not so much ourselves. And we don't like to change. We like to bounce and stay the same.
Yeah, essentially, the innovative thing for us to do here is to become less innovative.
Interesting.
But that's the bit where I do start going around in circles in innovation and maintenance, because actually doing something to a very high standard in coffee, that's why I use the word refinement and replication. We all know it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I think Christopher Ferran did an article on I can't remember its exact title, but it was something about the fallacy of consistency. Coffee is very hard to do consistently. And I do think if we look at a lot of what we would now call like doing something normally and consistently, that's born on the shoulders of innovation that happened at a certain time in the past, right?
Yeah.
It's not like we're making coffee the way it was made 500 years ago. So yeah, that's that interesting piece for me, not just in technology and the way we brew, but also the way we think about supply chains. I think this is happening with the way we think about coffee farmers and the supply chain and global north, global south, premium coffee producers who are in a very strong position, got a good brand, travel internationally. That doesn't fit that narrative of a smallholder farmer that you're helping as a roastery by buying from, right?
Sure.
I know I covered a lot of this in my book, but I think this is the same thing here. That crusade to solve the supply chain in coffee is also an innovative mindset, right? And I think it was Noah from Cafe Imports when he was saying 15 years ago when they were going around, had people on the ground working with whether it was mills or cooperatives or different farmers talking about point scoring and price and value. And they said at the time that interaction, I never really liked the term education, but that interaction resulted in clear immediate improvement and benefits for coffee being sold for higher prices relative for its quality. But once you've gone and done that awareness piece, he said, look, that is not the case now. He's like, all the farmers we work with, they know the market, they know what their coffee's worth, and it is a business interaction. So I always think it's really interesting for you think about sustainability brands now, a lot of sustainability brands present themselves as innovative, and really a lot of them, all they're doing is they've made a choice to build a product in a more sustainable way. That in and of itself won't last very long. If that is a sustainable way to do it, then the other competitors will do the same thing, and then you have no differentiation anymore. So any sort of new sustainable environmental brand, I always worry about its longevity. And actually, if we want lots of brands to be sustainable, there's no marketing position to be sustainable anymore. You're just back to the brand being good good at what it's doing, right? And I think that's the same piece here, is if we actually do see the change we want to see, then a bunch of people's narratives becomes redundant. It becomes something of the past. Just to be clear, I'm not saying the coffee supply chain problems are solved, but I never thought a small indie coffee company was solving them anyway. That's a different conversation. But that's that piece here, which is going, okay, we actually have solved the thing. How do we adapt and evolve? And I think I've seen this with water research and all the things I'm involved in. Quite a lot of time has passed on some of those. And it's really interesting to see how the market and the community has changed. And you kind of need to sit back and, we live in today, right? So you can't be sitting on your past glories, really, and actually rethink it from today. And these are obvious things to say, like staying open-minded and being humble, because I think one of the issues in any expertise-driven field is you become narrow easily. You need to make sure you maintain the openness of coming to it fresh. I even saw this the whole time I've been in coffee. People who came into work in coffee super excited by this whole world they didn't know about. They learnt it all really quickly, and then they said they were bored. And it's not that coffee is boring, it's that those individuals will find anything boring after doing like 3 or 4 years at it and learning the key bits. They're the people that want to jump across things, which is totally valid as well, right? For them as an individual. But again, that's down to a character identity piece rather than an industry problem. And actually for me, when I look at where I think value sits, I think it doesn't sit on constantly trying to be new. It sits on, you're never going to stay still. You're never going to say, hey, everyone, let's just stop and stay still. That's not going to happen. But I think the things we're focusing on will become maybe more constant. Like I think about this with processing and weird coffees out of Colombia with, inoculation of local bacteria and yeast, and they taste like soap and stuff. I think those coffees definitely feed in to this desire to have something new in coffee.
Sure.
And I saw an article the other day saying, our washed coffee is popular again. I'm like, mate, they never went away. Why are you like it's
I saw that too, yeah.
But it's interesting because there's actually such a small little echo chamber here, that's the other thing. If you look at the big, wide coffee industry, a lot of this obsessive novelty innovation is right up the pointy end, right? It's up the super high end, geeky end. It's probably not. However you want to break the coffee market up and say, okay, you've got mass premium, whatever, mass commercial, it is up the very pointy end. And there's often a little echo chamber there of individuals, because I've always said coffee businesses are often making choices compared to their peers, not thinking about their customer experience. There's a lot of brands who feel like they're in a friendly competition with each other to be the most relevant or new or interesting coffee brand.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is making choices around doing something weird with packaging or in relation to that peer group, not really because there's a demand experientially from customers, right?
Of course, yeah. And it's a bid for recognition, feedback to allow us to get our bearings. And in some ways, maybe it's simply the day and age we live in that we demand a dopamine response for every action we do as a validation. So we have a lack of personal resiliency in aggregate creates a lack of resiliency in an industry, because all we are as a community is a collection of individuals. And the idea that you put out to your staff and the way you view coffee, like the swordsmith or people who are chefs for a long time in an old world tradition. Tradition is based on a lot of innovations that have become useful enough to have stood the test of time and effective rather than simply new. And the humility piece comes when you allow yourself to be changed by a thing rather than you changing it. And we have an episode a while ago in praise of long-term employment, the deep valley you go into when you feel like you need to go find another job. The idea is if you traverse that, you might find yourself on the up again because it was more about your personal journey into maturity than it was about that business being wrong for you and so forth. So it feels like we have a lot of personal reckoning to do before we start demanding that the industry reckon itself.
Absolutely. And I think when I hire more than ever, and obviously the longer I'm in it, it's important to me that people stay with me for a longer period of time. And my perspective changes for sure. And I'm definitely doing that piece. I'm thinking about what the person wants from the job, why they're applying. And I had jobs right at the beginning where I was there. At the time, I was so hungry to learn and develop. 6 months seemed like a long time to me. Whereas now I'm like, it's not a long time at all. But yeah, I can easily see if someone's got a great interest for coffee. But I also don't necessarily know if they're as often as innovative as well. I think for you to truly understand the value. So if I think about staff members who have innovative thought processes, that are really valuable, that's often someone who isn't looking to just soak everything up in 4 months, ask loads of questions and leave. It's someone who's committed to what you're trying to do day in, day out. And, they really understand it. And then they think, okay, this area here could change. And that would really increase the value proposition, right?
Yeah.
It's either something more subtle or, less obvious. And that comes from people who are committed to that long-term vision. Because, it's a, like we say, again and again in coffee, you can come and get a job in any kind of front-facing, it's a hospitality job. And so your brain needs to be thinking about the customer and the experience, not just a theory about coffee channeling.
Hey everybody, it's Chris DiFurio. We'll get right back to our episode with Maxwell, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today's sponsor. So important. We can't do what we do without these sponsors. And I love what they do as well. First, we're talking about Ground Control. GroundControl.coffee is where you can go to learn about the Ground Control brewer. They are really close to releasing their second generation. First was the Cyclops. The world over, people are using the Cyclops brewer to really enhance their batch brew coffee, get ultimate control with the SCA award-winning technology, and they use that tech to also extract concentrates for cold brew and espresso-based beverages that they want to batch as well, like batched iced lattes. And so now the second generation that's coming out shortly is a lower MSRP. It's actually a smaller brewer with a higher output potential, 30% higher for concentrates of espresso and cold brew. And of course, it makes the same amazing batch brew that you would come to know and love if you've had a coffee from the Ground Control. So I would encourage you, if that sounds attractive to you, great coffee, all-in-one brewer, small footprint, high output. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to love here. So I would encourage you to check this out. You can find out more information over at groundcontrol.coffee. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Pacific Barista Series. The Barista Series is the line of plant-based performance beverages that is designed for baristas from the ground up. Every one of their extensive lineup, the selection they have, is based on a lot of feedback from professional baristas around the world. That's why it performs so well. It stands up to the heat from steaming. Texture is on point, and also you've got the flavor balance that allows the coffee to shine in every beverage. So if you go to pacificfoodservice.com, you can get samples sent to you and try it for yourself. I would encourage that because I think it's in the tasting, it's in the using that you're going to find the difference with the Barista Series. So go ahead and do that. Again, pacificfoodservice.com. If you're looking for the best plant-based beverages, I think you should try the Barista Series from Pacific. All right, everybody, back to our conversation with Maxwell Colonna Dashwood. I love what you said, because that journey of understanding the current position of something, if you're truly wanting to understand it, it's like if you're listening to somebody just to be able to speak, you're not actually listening to them. You're just waiting for your turn. You're hearing, but you're not listening. But if you listen to what has gone before you, you might find that it actually doesn't need to change as much as you thought it did, but the change you do bring to it is going to be so informed.
Absolutely right. And I definitely feel we've got a new member of staff at our roastery right now. But I also feel sorry for him, because no matter how much you do a handover or you explain what you're doing as a business, there's a lot of experience that the team has had before that person joined that they simply don't have. Mm-hmm. So they start saying, well, why don't you do this? And you're in danger of sort of sighing, which you try not to do, because you're thinking, wow, there's all these reasons we don't do that. But yeah, of course, you don't know those, right? And so often the person who's new, they haven't picked up all of that experience by osmosis about what is valuable and what isn't. And their question is genuine. They're not trying to be difficult. They're just asking genuine questions that someone who's new to that environment would ask. But to your point, it's a clear indicator that you only really understand certain things by putting enough time into them.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question here, because when we talk about coffee shops, our belief here at the Keys to the Shop podcast is the idea that a shop has a high degree of potential to create stability for the entire value stream. It's not just a service thing, it's a stewardship thing. And when I go to speak at trade shows, for example, some of the most well-attended talks, and I'm sure they're great talks, are around trends and these innovative, novel ideas of how are we going to stand out in the market and all these things. And what I find myself doing almost reflexively with my clients and elsewise is say, well, differentiation takes time, but let's focus on the basics and allow a greater period of time to create that success. And so it begs the question, what should we be focused on when it comes to a cafe? Because we have a limited amount of energy to give to certain things. And it feels very tempting to give it to the most shiny objects around us. But I imagine that we're missing a lot of things by doing that. So what are those vital areas we should be focusing on?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and point. The trade show one's interesting to me because I would say there's two talks that are really well attended. It's new and exciting and scary and worrying. Right. Which is basically the same as modern social media, right? Which is these two extremes. You want to be either sort of delighted and excited by something, but you're also really worried. And I did a talk recently on the idea of £5 flat white, and it was full of people who are really interested in that. You can see, basically for me, it's an indication that a lot of operators are worried about the viability of their business as they need to put prices up. They're less profitable than they were 10 years ago in the UK. But they also are quite rightly worried about their customer base's appetite for a price increase. It depends where you are in the UK. Certain places are more resilient if your customers are more affluent, all these kind of worries. And I think, maybe a trade show is never probably isn't the greatest place to focus on the fundamentals. I think the fundamentals are really day in, day out. We could definitely focus on them more in those kind of environments. But I think there's a confidence issue, which is you need to know which pieces of your business have the biggest bang for buck and stay true to those and be confident in those as an operator. And to your point just there, like having a new shiny thing, I don't think that's just a mindset of someone who wants to be relevant or important. I also think that there are operators who are worried about their relevance. They're worried about being complacent. They don't want to fall behind. And that's an interesting concern for a business operator to have that they don't have in the first couple of years, right? But they have after 5, 10 years, 15, 20 years, and sort of making sure your business evolves with the market and you stay relevant. So I think there's some very genuine good reasons to be interested in making sure that you've considered the latest innovations and whether you should implement them into your business. But I think it ultimately comes down to understanding your value proposition. And you need to be good at stripping things away to say, well, what's really important here? So what do I really need to deliver the experience that we're trying to deliver as a business? And what's superfluous to that? There is a challenge there with staff, which is each of your team member will be on their own journey. And if you haven't constantly reiterated that journey or made that culture work around a shared goal, I do think it's common that you might have some long-term members of staff who are looking for something which is sort of in your wheelhouse, but slightly off to one side. You could do it, but is it really a great focus for the business? And I don't think that's an easy one. If the person's really great, they've been with you for years, the team love them, the regulars love them, then maybe that's where you flex a little bit and bring in something that they find interesting. The modern barista issue, I think, is if they like competitions and newness, they're probably not ideal for most cafes. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
To your point about focusing, for me, it's being customer centric. So it's being able, no matter how long you've been open, to walk through the doors of your establishment and put yourself in the shoes of all different types of customers and be able to really sort of see whether that experience is being delivered to a high level. And a lot of it, this is the whole impressive maintenance thing. A lot of it's really small, unexciting stuff. Scott Rayo did a post on cleaning and he said this post isn't a joke. So, about cleaning cups and making sure they don't taste of soap. But, it's these little things of doing something very well, which in your mind's eye, you think, okay, if I was born 100 years ago and I had to learn to be a chippy or a furniture maker, that's basically the mindset. It would be about very small details being done to a very high standard, and none of them are glossy, but they come together to create something of a high quality that's beautiful. And, just be around attention to detail, cleaning, how the team communicate and work together, how that team, it's a team sport. I guess it's like trying to be, when you see rugby and people who are really into them, they talk about the idea of like a perfect team. And there was like a moment in time where this team was like the perfect example of football played to its best. And I think we need more of that mentality around cafes. So what happens when you come in, right? Of course, everyone's got a slightly different vision, but I don't know if you recently saw that article Sprudge did about studying 2-star reviews to decide which coffee shop to go to. Did you see that?
I did not read it. I saw the headline though.
Yeah, the headline was sort of a bit misleading, I think. It was really saying that you can get a better idea of the coffee shop by reading the 2-star reviews. If it's like someone's like, okay, the coffee was too small and expensive, maybe actually you do want to go there. Because if everywhere's really well reviewed, how do you tell the difference, right?
Yeah.
If everywhere's 4.7 to 5. But I was joking with our team about it because there's a friend of mine who's just opened a shop in London and he's he's been behind the scenes in coffee a long time and now he's opened a shop. It's a high profile shop with an amazing menu and concept, and he's been messaging me because he's had like 1 or 2 bad reviews. He's had loads of 5-star reviews. People love it. But those 1 or 2 just kill him. You know?
Right. Yeah.
He's saying, I can't believe how personally I'm taking it. And I said, yeah, I said, look, I've done it for 16, 17 years now. And when that review comes through, I still think, please just be a nice 5-star review, because I don't think I've got the emotional bandwidth to deal with a difficult review today. I think you can get into a habit with review systems where you ignore them, but sometimes I think you can learn from them for sure. Like, I'm definitely not saying you can't. However, there is a lot of reviews out there that are just not relevant to you. Like, if someone doesn't get your concept, and they're entitled to give it a 1 or 2 star if it doesn't suit them. But the reason I'm explaining all of this is that sort of 5-star experience, I think even if you've got a different concept, so my shop with no house coffee compared to a place that's smashing out, house coffee every day, a lot of what makes both shops have quality and integrity over the time are the same things. A great team that is aware and sees customers. Customers want to be seen. That's the same the world over. Like, they want to be recognized and seen, and they want someone to take an interest in them as an individual. And yes, you as a brand are trying to do what you're doing, but try and understand each individual customer and within reason, tailor your hospitality to those customers. And I think the thing about hospitality is it's not easy. It's very hard. There was an American mayor, and she said that she learned the most in her career waitressing in New York. When I first got into hospitality, that's what amazed me about it. I was like, okay, this is difficult. To do this really well is like a lot of energy, and it's difficult, and you need to love that. And I think that's the maintenance piece here, which is the people who just like the new shiny thing, they shouldn't stay in cafes. I'm not saying you can't love both. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, but you need to really love and find it rewarding, the core aspects of what you do. And like, you meet people who love coffee but get tired by hospitality. And it could be because of, some element, they're slightly introverted, or everyone's different. I was reading, was it Layla Gambari's post about how hard she can find trade shows as someone who's a bit introverted, and, it takes a lot of energy. And I get all of this. And I think this is a career piece here. It's about, you have to find something. You have to look at jobs and see what's the core professional capability required of the job. And is that aligned with me, right? Because of course, environments should be able to be flexible and have different character types in a diverse workplace. But if someone's sort of what makes them tick is diametrically opposed to the core fundamentals of running that space, then it's not going to work for either side, right? So I keep coming back to hospitality, but when I hire people, I'm like, of course, they always understand that there's a high level of product knowledge required. And you can't really, in a specialist space, give a great hospitality experience or a hosted experience unless you have the good product knowledge. But I think it's about taking delight in people having wonderful experiences day in, day out. And they're different. They're often, I think, a lot of us who are doing something more specialty or innovative, we're always thinking of the new customer. Because that's the innovation thing again. That person who's visited from Colombia, who's heard about your shop and wants to come and chat to you. That's exciting that someone's come all that way. They know about your shop and they've sought you out. That's super exciting. But actually, what percentage of customers are they? Maybe 5 or 10%.
Yeah.
And so, it is that regulars piece. No one's got a successful coffee shop without a more regular customer base. And those interactions are different. They're more about a social space for these people to come into. Yes, you're probably going to chat about coffee because that's one of the focuses of your shop. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's these elements of a space for people. So it's run by people, for people, and that being the focus. And obviously, from a technology point of view, you need technology that allows you to deliver the product you want to deliver with the right amount of engagement. I think we previously touched on the automation debate, but I think that comes in here as well. And I remember on our last podcast, we talked about this idea that when a new bit of technology comes along, it often solves a problem, but takes something else away. If you're thinking about maintenance, if you're thinking about what are the things we do really well, I think you'll be much more aware of that danger. You won't be as excited by a new piece of equipment that completely changes your environment. You'll actually be a bit worried by it. You'll be like, okay, this is interesting, but what's it going to do to this part of our experience? And how's it going to affect, how our team engage with the drinks they make and the customers? And I think that's where we're getting. And I think that's a good thing that the market is more saturated. There is a higher standard, I think, required to operate. You're not going to keep customers just because you managed to get some good coffee. It's much easier to get good coffee, right?
Yeah.
So I think excelling in the coffee shop space these days is about being a great hospitality operator more than it is about being a great coffee operator.
One thing that we're thinking about here is obviously, what's an example of where innovation and the obsession or pursuit of novelty at all costs, I suppose, is a bad thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's some clear practical examples where either there's a lot of wasted energy or it just results in a bad experience. So I remember being in coffee early and going to a coffee shop that was definitely perceived as, and I believe would self-identify as, a progressive, innovative cafe, to the point where they always wanted to be trying something new. And if they had kept the way they were brewing coffee the same, that was a failure. Right. And I remember going in and sat down and they presented me with a coffee. And I said, oh, so how are you brewing the coffee at the moment? And they said, right, so we're trying this different technique. And they explained a novel way to preparing the coffee. And I said, great. And how's it working? They're like, not very well, to be honest. We don't think the coffee tastes very good. And then they took my £3.50. And I was like, what?
Points for honesty. I mean,
you laugh and I laugh. And when I tell that story, people laugh. But they were dead serious. They absolutely believed that pursuing an interesting way of preparing the coffee was more valuable than delivering me with a high quality beverage.
That's really interesting.
And I remember thinking at the time, this is so interesting, because if you said that on the door or when I came in, I don't know how many people would come in, but like, that's the honesty. We always say about hospitality that it's about managing expectation. And I was excited about a great cup of coffee. And instead I got told it was actively not going to be great.
Yeah.
I always think if you're going to try R&D, when people learn to cut hair and you go and get a cheap haircut, right? Or I'm very sort of passionate about the idea that it shouldn't be done on the customer. And you should only really deliver that into your business when two things. You go, okay, we've trialed this at length and we believe this is an improvement. We also know how we're going to implement it into day-to-day operations and it's going to work. Right. So that was one clear example that came to me that I've remembered for years. That was over a decade ago. I still think it happens. People do it with things like, and it often happens with the higher value stuff, right? So let's say a shop is like, okay, our house coffee, it's this blend in this grinder in milk. Then the brew bars are often like a paradox of a higher, expensive, worse experience, because that's where people play around. So the brew bars in a lot of shops is often somewhere where you're going to wait longer. A lot of shops like, oh, it's 3:00 and we don't have many staff, we're not doing pour overs or whatever. But it's also where people will explore and experiment with things because it's easier to do so. And so I find that a bit odd that you paid more money, waited longer, and there was less proven consistency or testing of the product that you're about to get. But the other example I was going to give you was this discussion around climate change. This is a very important topic, obviously. I think when we've had the first frosts in Brazil, the most recent spike in the sea, 21-22 with the frosts in Brazil, your old school traders point out, frosts happen all the time historically. And then actually now those traders have given up on that, realizing that actually there is a higher frequency of volatile weather events. And obviously the sea price again at the moment, very high, both Vietnam weather, Brazil weather, lots of weather. And there was already this conversation about, okay, how resilient is coffee going to be to, rather than saying climate change, just, more volatile climate events. One of the things that happened was people would say, shame that Robusta is not as good as Arabica. But what we've seen with Vietnam is Robusta's a plant too. Like if the weather's awful, Robusta's not going to do very well either, right? It can't just deal with it. But I think about Liberica and I think about the conversation saying, okay, maybe we could utilize Liberica here. But what I often saw around the innovation, and this is and I'm not necessarily against this, right? Because I think high-end restaurants or chefs, they are pursuing their vision for something and presenting it to the customers. They're not like a mainstream. And I always think high-end coffee's like that. So to suggest that boutique coffee should be trying to please the mass customer is odd to me. I'm like, it's much more similar to me to a restaurant where the chef is exploring their vision for the food. I think that's a big part of boutique coffee. Individuals or small teams exploring their vision. However, we need to realize, this is one of my things around this idea of innovation in boutique coffee, is often boutique coffee doesn't understand how its so-called innovation will then play out across the actual industry, right?
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is people playing around with weird fermentation methods to make Liberica taste like an anaerobic Arabica. And then they're like, oh, look, what do you think? It's not as good as the anaerobic Arabica, but it's quite good, right? And I'm like, but for who? If the solution is to try and grow Liberica on a scale to compete with mass-produced Arabica to deal with supply and climate, nobody buying those coffees wants it to taste like a micro-lot anaerobic. There's an assumption that, okay, if something's a higher scoring point coffee, it's more valuable. You're like, well, yes, but only to the supply and demand dynamic at play. So often these coffees are produced within a microcosm of there's enough customers for them. Let's say it's a boutique producer in Panama or Colombia and they've got 30 hectares or 100 hectares. You can produce something really interesting and sell it to the Far East. or do well in competitions or brand your farm well. But if you're actually talking about an innovative solution for producing coffee at scale around the world, you've got to be careful not to think that the innovations in the boutique sphere are relevant to the commercial sphere.
Ah, yes.
I'm sort of saying, look, whether it's Eugeenoides saying Eugeenoides could be a climate option when a Eugeenoides is really hard to grow and you get hardly any coffee on a tree. It's a different species that tastes interesting. Is that innovation relative to solving that actual problem? And I think that's one of the issues, is a lot of energy goes into focusing on innovation that doesn't actually solve the problem it sets out to solve, which is a similar issue, I guess, to the one I mentioned even in the cafe, which is like a microcosm of that, which is what is it you're actually trying to do and what does success look like? Otherwise, we call it innovation, which almost gives it a badge of honor that it doesn't deserve if it's just tinkering around to play with something, right?
That's exactly the kind of thing that we can't shield ourselves from the responsibility to forecast the impact, because we can't pretend as though we're going to tinker or innovate and that it is in that vacuum, because it will have this ripple effect. And in the cafe is very similar in the way that people perceive coffee is shaped by the cafe experiences that they have, whether for better or for worse. And that's why focusing the way that you're advocating to on the everyday experiences and the excellence and the maintenance is such an important thing. The idea of being a hospitality operator is you're a student of your customer base, and just the idea of the experience itself, which we do conflate sometimes with the novel, but the experience of the day in, day out. To be a student of that is to pursue understanding it yourself versus seeking to, and in a lot of cases, because of the way we run things, it's almost as though we are forcefully demanding that people understand us before we spend very much sweat equity understanding them, which is kind of what we're saying we will do when we say we will serve you coffee. We will bring ourselves with humility to give you a thing with excellence, of course. But what the saying is, seek first to understand and then to be understood. It's the Stephen Covey quote from How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think one of the 31 principles.
I completely agree with you. Like, how can you? I said, look, unless you're some kind of Sherlock Holmes who can just look at someone and immediately understand their background and their knowledge, which quite frankly, I recommend no one does, because you will get it wrong.
Yes.
And you'll always be surprised by that customer who you think isn't into coffee at all and is extremely knowledgeable and experienced. But I say to my staff, just ask questions. People love to be, asked a simple question. It's great for you. You get to learn about them very quickly, and then you can adapt your experience around that.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to figure it out yourself is kind of absurd, right? There's so many different people who will walk into a shop, but that skill is, that one I think there's not enough time focused on. For people who haven't done a lot of it, they just like, how do you do it? And it's sort of like, it's not actually as clever as you think it is. It's actually based on asking questions, taking a bit of time, not loads of time. I'm not talking about having a 10-minute conversation, just a few questions to try and understand a bit more about where that customer's coming from. And then you should be able to do a better job talking them through and finding some kind of connection with what you do.
Yeah, it is an issue of knowledge versus wisdom in some cases, because the idea of wisdom is simply experiences that are naturally, you can't help organize information in your brain. That's the way the brain is. And if you spend enough time with people, like the mayor example of waiting tables or asking questions and having the experience of interacting with the public for years, if you are paying attention and absorbing those experiences, you will walk away with more wisdom as a base from which to make decisions, as you say, about innovation that actually do serve the greater thing that you are spending most of your time fortifying with your attention and excellence as a goal.
Absolutely. I mean, in that podcast, they had an example of American infrastructure, and simple maths about, debates about putting money into water systems or roads or public transport. And that in nearly every level, however expensive it was to do the work in the short term, it saved money in the long term, because it would be so much worse not to do the work and let the infrastructure fall apart, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the same case here, is if you're focusing on, making the core of what you do, looking after it day in, day out, that's going to do you the benefits in the long run. It would be lovely if a shiny new piece of technology was able to solve those problems. But that's kind of what I love about the space, is that it's hard won. Like what you just said there about someone spending years doing it, rather than being like, I've done it for 10 years, I'm exhausted by hospitality. ideally you'd want to be like, I've done it for 10 years. I'm really good at it.
Yeah.
There's maybe a modern piece here around how we view hospitality and when we expect people to do those jobs in their lives, at what ages and parts of their career. And I know there's a piece there around earning potential, etc. But I actually think coffee shops are very well positioned to be a counter to this, because in the business book, well, maybe it's not in the book directly, but since writing the book and speaking to people, I say, look, I think an independent coffee shop is more comparable to the European family-owned restaurant model or family-owned cafe model, which is if you're going to work in it as the owner-operator with a team, there's actually a model there that can be a good living. And an operator who runs a restaurant for 40, 50 years and they love it right up until the end and they find it energizing and rewarding to be in that space, I understand how it's harder to create that environment with a flow of transient staff who are doing it as an in-between job. You'll get the odd one who's like, oh, actually doing this well is really hard and I'm into this. And they'll take those skills off somewhere else. But I actually think the owner-operated shops are best positioned to really drive that experience because it should come from the top. And if you do want to be in this, and I often say to people now, one of my revelations writing the book is, I do want to be in this industry for another 20, 30 years. You start to think long instead of short. And then you do, I think, when you think of longevity, start to be like, oh, what is it we're trying to do over these years? And when I look back on it and want to be proud of what we did, is it something new and shiny, which wouldn't be new and shiny in 5 years' time even, right?
Yeah.
Or is it that we actually delivered a really high quality experience consistently, and that those less tangible values of people know what they are, and it's lovely to get that feedback for people to say, I really love the staff, the experience, the coffee was great, of course. Those are the things I think to be prouder of than the innovation. I think I had a little bit of this when I got angry and pushed back on coffee competitions. When I was caught up in them, they were my life. But I think coffee competitions are often sort of the epitome of trying to do something new and novel. And then when you look back on them over time, you're like, well, what is the values here that are really being focused on? And then I sort of look back on it and I'm like, how much do I value doing well in those competitions? I appreciate the opportunities I got from doing well. But when I think about what I've achieved professionally, they're not up there at all. Yeah, for me anyway, So I'm not trying to be nonchalant about them, but the shops and building great relationships with people are the things that I feel I'm more proud of.
Excellence in the everyday things as you start to fully explore what you believed were the benefits of whether it's competitions or a piece of equipment or innovation in a pairing menu or something, it quickly fades. It's like chewing gum. The flavor, it was functional for a moment, but it's not sustaining. It's not nutritionally dense as the day in, day out regularity of hospitality is. And so you start to crave a little bit more healthy things, I suppose it would be fair to say. So you start to see the value of those things that you spurned before. You're like, oh, no.
And I think it would be similar to exercise as well. I like your chewing gum analogy, but I think of exercise this way. And I finished doing coffee competitions, and generally you're not very healthy when you do coffee competitions. You're working all day, and then you're up all night, and you're stressed. Your cortisol levels are super high. But as a competitive person, which I often think a lot of people who are perfectionists or whatever are, I initially got into the exercise through being interested in the challenges and goal setting. And I'm a goal-orientated person. But over time, the real value of exercise in someone's life is it's part of your maintenance. People talk a lot about health span now instead of lifespan in the longevity space. And I think there's a very comparable example, which is you put that time in how many days a week, 4 days a week or whatever, and the real benefit is doing it. Recently, someone said the word consistency they didn't like. They preferred frequency. As long as your frequency is there, you don't have to be doing it on exactly the same time at the same day. You just have to hit a certain frequency over time, which I quite liked. But I think they're similar, these things, which is seeing the value in it being a part of something you do day in, day out over time, which is back to the whole classic journey instead of the destination, right? Often a flashy new bit of kit or a competition or something is a very clear destination, but there's something very valuable about doing it day in, day out to a high standard without even having a specific award in mind or anything,
I agree. And I feel like this conversation is a good grounding set of ideas that I feel is needed in our industry. And naturally, I think you and I and others who might think similarly are just part of what might be a balancing act of ideas as we've naturally gone through these things over the years. Now we're starting to pick up, and our spidey sense says, hey, we need to kind of correct a little bit this direction. And that's why I'm grateful for this perspective, because it is about effective cafe operation and service, and effective to create thriving for the most people possible in the space, all up and down the value stream, plus the consumer's experience. So thank you. Thank you for being here to chat a little bit more about this idea that you posted. And I would really love to have people take this seriously and meditate on this after they are done listening to it. And also to check out more of your work. Let us know where we can find more about your book. Of course, we have the past episode, we talked about your most recent book, but get us plugged into where you are online.
MaxwellDashwood.com is where the books are, and me and Chris are already behind on the Water for Coffee 2 launch date. But that book is a good example of innovation v maintenance, which is, the original book was very much about being like, there's a real question here that doesn't seem very well addressed. And then you put something out into the world and it's quite disruptive, hopefully in a positive way. Then 10 years pass, and a lot of people are, again, we're using water every day, right?
Yeah.
But there's also things that I've noticed, and I think this is one of the challenges with the taste field, is there's something you pick up on when you taste something day in, day out that you can't do once off, or when you're new to it. You just can't. So a lot of what I've been adding to that book is sort of slow learnings around water by experiencing that topic day in, day out for a decade after writing the first book.
Yeah.
And obviously listening to lots of other people's ideas and thoughts on it as well. Colonna Coffee is sort of my day job, where I try and bring this idea of like quality and maintenance. I'm involved in some R&D stuff, and this really makes me think about this, because the guy who runs that is a biotech inventor. I don't know if we talked about him last time, did we, James?
We may have.
He invented the world's smallest DNA analyzing machine quite a while ago now. Hated biotech because it's very litigation heavy. It's quite high risk, loved coffee. And he'd been inventing coffee ideas for a while, and he comes at it from left field. He's not in coffee. And then in COVID, he sold that biotech company and invested all in a 25,000 square foot R&D coffee space in Yorkshire in the north of England. He's adamant he doesn't want to be a maker. He doesn't want to manufacture things, because he feels like you can't be as innovative and creative if you have to become a maker. And I think this is part of the friction that we're coming across in this conversation. And I do think there is a friction there. It's a different flow or mindset to do something again and again to the same standard, to focus on repetition, than it is to focus on rethinking the fundamentals. A lot of big companies have this problem. And, if you're really big, maybe you're lucky that you can have a whole R&D team in a separate part of the factory locked off who think about innovation. And then the team who are actually making the product day in, day out, well, what do those customers care about? They care that it works the same and it doesn't break. They don't want you to rethink it. And so they're kind of opposed. And so I get to go up there, and I like it, because when I go up there, my brain goes into innovation space. Everything he does will be licensed to a partner. He doesn't have to, he has to think about how it's going to be made, for sure. Like, for it to be successful, he needs to know what it means to hit the market and actually have to work. So he tries to simplify designs as much as possible to make them easier to manufacture, and so on and so forth. But then when I come back to my roastery in my shops, my brain's the other way. It's like, okay, we now need to go into this other flow of, are we complacent anywhere? Are we doing something to a very high standard day in, day out? And they're sort of different modes for your brain, I think. And trying to have all of those in one environment or space, I think, is very challenging. And I don't think anyone ever fully gets that right. It's sort of a bit of a juggling act, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, maybe to put it lightly, and that tension's going to be a huge part, right?
Yeah, but I bring that up because that's the work I do there, and we're focusing a lot on grinding. And that's one of those things where, everyone's using grinders every day to make coffee. And I can moan about existing grinder technology, but it's also very robust and people are using it day in, day out. And so the things I do there will probably come to the world, and you'll see them come through partnerships. And we're hoping to bring a grinder idea which is a different way of grinding coffee, not traditional flat or conical burr. That should come to the market in time. You never know, we might write a book about, I've often thought there could be a book about innovations in coffee. And to this point of this conversation we're having, I think whether it's a maintenance piece or just a positive way to think about innovation, specialty often has not been very good at appreciating the innovation that either historical or large coffee companies do or have done. And I think a lot of the times we in specialty or boutique ride the coattails of work that was done in commercial coffee. And then we stand up and say how awful commercial coffee is. We're like, oh, we'll take your idea, thanks.
Yeah.
Water for Coffee 2 should be out, I would imagine, at this rate, early next year. But yeah, Colonna, which is my day job, the coffee roastery is based near Bristol, and we've got the two shops, the shop in Bath and the shop in London. And that's sort of the bulk of my work, I think, at the moment. I think when you've been in coffee a long time, your heroes maybe change a bit. It's definitely have a lot of time for people like Tim Wonderbow or George Howe, people who've been in it a long time they're kind of doing the same thing they started doing. But for me, I think they're showing signs that they're not getting complacent there, but they're also not being diverted or distracted by just trying to do something new and novel. They're actually sort of doing that iterative refinement over time piece. And so that's what I'm trying to do more of in my business.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. I love the exploration of this not being a thing of step 1, step 2, step 3. It is a personal exploration, but I think these ideas are great things to think about. And I would encourage everybody to follow up and check out your work. But Maxwell, as always, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for asking me to come on. I love discussing these topics with you, so I really appreciated it.
Okay, everyone. Well, I hope that you loved that conversation with Maxwell. I could have talked to Maxwell for so much longer about this topic because it feels very of the moment in the midst of the sea of options and innovations and novelties and areas we can go. It can be overwhelming, and it's affirming to hear somebody of Maxwell's experience level in innovation and in the world of competitive coffee and in the operation of coffee shops, speaking this way about excellence in the everyday, in the maintenance of that excellence. For the foundation of our business is based on this stuff. And when we start to get excited about and energized by and make ourselves students of the process of doing this, that's a very innovative thing to do today in coffee. And it's an old way, but it's not ever something that's old in that it's irrelevant. It's old in that it develops more luster. It develops more meaning as it ages, like the tone wood on a guitar or the traditions of the swordsmith that Maxwell talked about in the conversation today, and many other points in the conversation that I'm sure for you just hit the right way. I would encourage you, think about those things. How do I take that thing that resonated and actually apply it in a way that makes a difference in my maturity as a professional, as an operator, as a leader, and then the operations themselves? How can they then follow suit to maximize our effectiveness in maintaining the quality and the experience that we want to give people in the everyday? So a huge thank you to Maxwell for joining us on the show again. You should go and follow Maxwell on Instagram. That's M Colonna Dashwood. And then also go to the website maxwelldashwood.com. Find out all about his books and writing, etc. And those are two places that will just get you plugged into that whole world. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me, then go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. And now, speaking of foundations, one of the things that is obvious about a coffee shop is that it's built on a foundation and that there is a feel to the coffee shop. There is something about the material that you use in creating a space that almost speaks to the immaterial. The feel, the vibe, the atmosphere, etc., ambiance, however you want to say it. When you use the right materials and quality materials to build the bar, it really makes a difference. That's why I'm so excited to welcome to the show as a sponsor, Arto Brick. Find them on Instagram @ArtoBrick. They can walk alongside you with all of your hard surface, stone, and tile needs in your cafe. If you go to arto.com, you can see their catalog of tiles and also projects that they've worked on. They are so excited about working with the coffee industry. I met one of the owners, Armin, of Arto. They have a very rich history of craftsmanship, and they're excited, very excited about helping coffee shops create unique and amazing spaces through providing you with the best in stonework and hard surfaces and tiles for your cafe. So check them out again on Instagram. Tell them Chris sent you @ArtoBrick, and then find them online as well, arto.com. All right, everybody. Well, that is the end of our show today. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. Don't forget to subscribe, share the show, rate and review, and all that fun stuff. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.